Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hoover Institution Workshop on using text as data in policy analysis. In this workshop, we feature applications of natural language processing, structured human readings, and machine learning methods to text as data to examine policy issues in economics, history, national security, political science, and other related fields. I'm Justin Grimmer. Steve Davis and I co-organized the workshop. We're thrilled today to have Michelle Torres, who is an assistant professor of political science at UCLA. She's presenting work that's joint with Allison Archer, who's an assistant professor at the University of Houston. Their paper is titled Benevolent Billionaires, Evaluating the Influence of Wealthy Owners on Local News. Before we get started, let me just set some quick ground rules. Michelle's going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A feature. Steve and I might interject as Michelle's presenting with any pressing questions. And after Michelle wraps up, if you have a question, we might recognize you and ask you to speak your question or ask your question live. After about an hour of Michelle's presentation and then a total Q&A, we'll turn the recording off and we'll go to a more informal session. And in this informal session, we can ask Michelle some more nuts and bolts style questions to really understand how the research was done. So with all that being said, Michelle, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Justin. I will quickly share my screen here. So thank you again, Justin, and thank you, Steve, for having me here, for inviting me, and thank you to everyone for joining to hear this presentation. This project is co-authored with the amazing and incredible Allison Archer at UH. And in this paper, we are really interested in kind of disentangling the relationship between local news, billionaire owners, and basically political accountability. Uh, um, it's a kind of unorthodox project because it really came up the motivation comes from observing the world science, and we discussed the question. We thought it was really interesting that we were observing these billionaires purchasing newspapers, and we were like, okay, what are the consequences from this? So that's how we embarked in this project, and we are trying to be very rigorous in terms of the empirics and the data that we are using, but we don't have super strong theoretical expectations for what we're going to find. So it's like an exploration that it's been really fun, and we are really looking forward to your feedback, questions, and comments. So hopefully this is a crowd that doesn't need any convincing that news matter. Um, Mass political knowledge is shaped by the public's opportunities to learn from the media. And media is going to provide a lot of information and also hold actors accountable. Media outlets can raise awareness of those with low political interest. And research has found that they have potential effects, even if minimal, on polarization, trust, and other attitudes. So overall, media has the potential and this power of really affecting things that we care about, political outcomes that are part of a healthy and vibrant civic culture. But we also know from research and from experience and from traditional media that they are in a crisis, right? For some years, we've been seeing decline of traditional local media, and it's been well documented that there's a decline of the local news industry, which is alarming if we consider that there's also been a lot of research talking about the political importance of local news. So we have these pieces like from Eric Peterson on how increasing the number of staff cuts actually lead to a decrease of political coverage, which eventually translates in less political participation and lower turnout rates. Based on these challenges that local media and local outlets are facing, they really have to come with difficult decisions to deal with these difficult times. And some of these difficult decisions have to do mostly with ownership changes and ways of literally rescuing some of these newsrooms. So, who are these new owners or these people coming to save these newsrooms, and what kind of rules are they going to impose? And for that, we need to consider that there are different types of owners. We have anything from hedge fund vultures and ideologically motivated corporations. They're really just coming to crush and get as much as possible from these dying businesses. We also have nonprofit news organizations and local business people who had a deep commitment to these news outlets because this is the newspaper that they've been reading since they were kids and that have almost an emotional attachment with all of these things. But we also have this very interesting group of people, billionaire owners, entrepreneurs that actually have nothing to do with with the journalism area or the media space. And we are interested in like basically analyzing what do they want, or at least what do they claim that they want, because there might be a disconnection between between just the two things, what they want and what they are like telling the world that they want to do with these newspapers, and what we are actually observing in terms of the decisions that they are making for the newspaper once they take over it. So why billionaires? It's an interesting group to analyze for sure, but probably now experience is telling us that they have resources, they have power, and they had this potential of really playing a key role in shaping public's opinion, political outcomes, attitude formation, and some social dynamics that are important. So I will tell you about a typology of billionaires and billionaire owners that we identified, at least based on what they say, or based on the motivations that they like claim to have for like purchasing newspapers. And you might be familiar with this typology for other things in life. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the good is people like Jeff Bezos, who, for example, acquired the Washington Post in 2013, and that came with like these ideas and like these statements about the commitment that he had to the Washington Post, because it was like a crucial part of like a functioning democracy and a vibrant community. So he had this statement that this is the newspaper in the capital city of the most important country in the world. The Washington Post has an incredibly important role to play in this democracy. There's no doubt in my mind about that. So really acknowledging the crucial role that a newspaper like the Washington Post plays in our normal dynamics. And like him, we have other people like John Henry, who acquired the Boston Globe, Glenn Taylor, the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, or Patrick Soon-Shiong, the LA Times and the San Diego Union Tribune. Again, all of these people acknowledging the importance of the newspapers and saying that they really want to contribute and they really want to like make them better. You also have the bad in the sense that they don't have like these grandiose motivations or objectives or of like making the papers vibrant, but rather that take them as like businesses. So one example is Sam Zell, who acquired the Tribune Co. He is considered or is named or was named because he passed away, the graveyard dancer of real estate, because he was able to like bring businesses back to life. And he purchased the Tribune Co. with this idea of like really just make profit out of it. So it's not that I don't have opinions and it's not that I don't feel strongly about things, but I didn't make this investment for any other reason than economic gain. So very open, very candid about his intentions. At the end, it turned out to be the worst deal in the history of the world. So I will, if you're interested, we can talk about it in the Q&A. But that was very clear from his objectives. Now, we have the ugly, which is, for example, Sheldon Adelson, who acquired the Las Vegas Review Journal, and who has he's a magnate in Las Vegas. And he has like a very clear intention of being ideological and shaping people's opinions towards this newspaper. So this is a quote from another journalist saying, coverage of issues Adelson cares about pretty much comes out of public relations. The idea that the Review Journal is run as an independent body is laughable. So people that are like actively using the newspapers to imprint or like fulfill their own ideological agenda. Okay, so this typology motivates the question of what's the real influence that these wealthy owners have on local news, and in a way, or like more broadly, how can we think of a framework for evaluating this influence? Okay, so we know that ownership is important. There's a lot of research on this. We know that ownership changes and structure affect what and how information becomes news content. We also know that owners might be ideologically driven, and that might affect the news content and the way in which voters or like people think about political events. And we also know that owners may have philanthropic goals regarding the role of a newspaper in promoting democratic values. And as you can see here, this one doesn't have like research citations, because this is mostly the news that like these billionaires owners coming and saying, yes, that's what we want. And we are like philanthropers, but there's really not much evidence about it. Okay, so what can billionaires do? they have these advantages, right? Like, why are these important key players that we should look at? They have the resources to invest in the newsroom and to actually save these like dying businesses. They can withstand short-term profit losses with an eye towards long-term success, something that is important, especially in journalism, where it's going to take some time to actually see a utility, and often view their media assets as philanthropic ventures. So they are motivated like that. However, they do not have, most of the time, journalistic backgrounds or longstanding commitment to news. So it could be just like a toy or like an impulse purchase that they do. And sometimes they are not really aware of the complexities of the media industry, especially the modern one. So this could lead to some frustrations and like some abandonment of the whole project. And they also are really busy, have other interests and business to attend. This is not the main thing that they care about. Okay, so we are going to focus on the case of the LA Times and the San Diego Union Tribune and Patrick Soon-Shiong. In June 2018, Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong purchased the LA Times and the San Diego Union Tribune together with few other community newspapers. Who is Patrick Soon-Shiong? He is a transplant surgeon and billionaire entrepreneur who had enjoyed a lot of success in other fields that are not related to media, which is biotechnology and pharmaceuticals. Although he took a crash course on media and journalism, he was really proud of it. And he paid 500 million for acquiring these California newspapers. He has a wide coverage of the philanthropic and entrepreneurial reasons behind the purchase. He gave 1 million of interviews talking about how this was like his little new project and he was really passionate about. So basically, we're gonna take him as our test. We wanna see like hold him accountable for what he said in those interviews and see whether his objectives are getting actually translated into content of the newspaper articles. Okay, so in order to develop this evaluation framework of these billionaires, but in particular Patrick Soon-Shiong, we're going to literally take the quotes that he had from all of these interviews and summarize all of the objectives and then put them to test. So one, he pledged to continuing the great tradition of award-winning journalism, inject stability to save the newsroom, recommit to the paper's investigative reporting work, and turn the LA Times into a resource for the community, strengthen the presence of the paper in LA by increasing digital subscriptions, and increase the coverage that holds other actors accountable. We're going to focus on those highlighted in orange. And we're going to study them by studying the news quality, like basically the typology of hard versus soft news and how prevalent they are in the things that the LA Times and the San Diego Union Tribune are publishing. We're going to also inspect the investigative reporting prevalence in the newspaper. We're going to evaluate whether he's focusing or the news content is focusing on local topics more than non-local, like national or international topics. We're going to see if he's increasing his efforts to reach viewers and also analyze the prevalence of accountability-related language in the news articles of the LA Times and the San Diego Union Tribune. So this is when I said it was a bit unorthodox. We have basically three hypotheses. One, he has improved the content, he has worsened it, or he had no impact. So we're just going to try to find evidence to give support to one of these three hypotheses. Our empirical strategy is the following. Soon-Shiong announced the purchase of the LA Times and San Diego Union Tribune in February of 2018. So this is going to be our treatment group, the LA Times and the San Diego Union Tribune, treatment understood as purchased by a billionaire. Then the deal was finalized in June 2018. So this is going to define our post-treatment period start. We are interested in assessing changes before and after the purchase, with some caveats that I will tell you about based on like each of the analyses that we will have. And assuming that before the treatment, before the purchase of Soon-Shiong, the LA Times, the San Diego Union Tribune, and a bunch of comparable newspapers publishing behavior had similar trends, we're going to estimate the effect of this purchase on content. And this is going to be the average treatment effect among the treated. Our approach is going to be a difference in difference approach. And we're going to vary the post-treatment period, like the start and end and like length, to also see changes over time. Our data and variables, first I will start with the variables. We're going to focus on indexes of investigative reporting, language related to accountability, We're going to try to classify news in two categories, local versus non-local. And we're also going to inspect the topics that we can find in this news with the idea that we identify hard versus soft local news, hard versus soft news, and local versus national or international. For the news articles, we basically have a big data set with all the news pieces published in the front page or A1 section of several newspapers. This was compiled by Newsbank. And because Newsbank didn't have the LA Times, we had to also complement this data set with this information from Newseum, like all the front pages that Allison has been collecting since 2012. So it's like a great thing that I don't think anyone else has. We are also scraped, well, we also scraped, back then it was still Twitter. You can tell that this project has been going for some time. We got the news feeds of all the California newspaper news feeds, their or official Twitter feed. And we're also using some indexes of investigative reporting and accountability published in an article by Turkel et al. In PNAS that uses a series of methods. Our newspapers are 8 California newspapers. So the Fresno Bee, the Sacramento Bee, LA Times, San Diego Union Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle. And for comparable newspapers, we wanted to have like a control or like a benchmark for California and like the things that these newspapers talk about in California, but also like a benchmark for other cities that are comparable to LA. And that's why we're including the Houston Chronicle, the Tampa Bay Times, and the St. Louis Dispatch, and another one, and the New York Times. Okay, so we have almost 28,000 articles from California papers and 30,000 from other newspapers and around 75,000 tweets. We are focusing on different parts. There are like a lot of moving parts in each of the analysis that I will show you. We are using the full text article of like many sections for the investigative reporting with the idea that we really want to exploit and analyze the content of published articles. This is like a central element of the newspaper, right? It's its core, but it's also like basically exposed to only their exclusive audiences or people who subscribe to them. So that's the reason why we're using Twitter as well. First of all, because the cost of distribution are lower, right? It's easier to actually make rapid or like sudden changes, and it's not that costly, and they will reach broader audiences. And we're also like focusing on the front pages and A1 sections. One, for data availability reasons, it's been very hard to get our hands on this data, but also to signal, because these sections signal the newspaper's priorities and they get greater exposure even if you don't read the full newspaper. Okay, so I will start. These are going to be 3 analyses. The first one is going to like inspect how specialized and high quality the content that we can find in the LA Times and San Diego Union Tribune are. And we are going to do this through the exploration of investigative scores and accountability language. Okay, so for this, the measurement comes from Turkel et al. They developed these investigative scores, which is basically an index telling you how investigative an article is. This is an output of a neural network trained on 562 articles that were manually coded as investigative and takes a bunch of features as input. Again, the score is basically the probability that a given article is investigative. And the criteria or like part of the features that compose this index are, for example, whether they want like an award in like relevant journalism contest, whether it was an article was entered into the database of the investigative reporters and editors for a regular contest, or other features like the article actual embeddings, the influence scores, which is one of my favorite parts of seeing how some articles might set the seed, and if they get cited or they there's like some spillovers to other news, that's like their influence because they start the conversation. Indicators of investigative reporting terms like audits, FOIAs, and investigative related word count, and section names. For the accountability related word count, this captures the proportion of words associated with characteristics such as accuse, allege, complain, or denounce. Things that are like calling for attention to like these topics. This measure is one. I want to like highlight that this word count is one of the 320 features that compose the investigative reported index, but we are not super concerned about whether we have like a huge overlap here. First of all, because this is just one of the features. We are using a transformation, and we even saw that the correlation is not super high. So the investigative reporting is capturing like one dimension, and this accountability related word count is capturing another one. We're gonna use the sum of investigative scores and the weekly proportion of accountability related words as our outcome variables here. And here we're gonna define the post-treatment period starting 6 months after the purchase, because articles that are supposed to have, for example, this investigative, like high investigative scores or more accountability related language take time. It's not that in 1 month after he purchased the newspaper, you can like start seeing changes. This is going to take some time because of the process of creating these articles. And this is the distribution of the two indexes, the accountability words proportion on the right and the sum of investigative reported index on the left. Okay, so I will show you here, we plotted like the raw data and like did some smooth transformations to assess whether we are fulfilling a parallel trends assumption before engaging in this diff in diff approach. And here is the index of investigative reporting, again, the sum of it. The red line shows the time of the start of the post-treatment period. We are here already removing the 6 months after treatment. So here you can see that actually before the treatment, we have some evidence that the things are working in parallel. The yellow line is the line depicting those newspapers owned by a billionaire, our treatment group, and those that were not owned by a billionaire are the blue line. And here before the treatment, we see like this parallel trend, but we see that after that, they basically split, and the difference, well, there's a gap between them. And this one is for the accountability words. Here is not as neat as beautiful, but this is for transparency. We have like some bumps here that it's also related that we have just two newspapers in this treatment group, so it's more sensitive to like some changes, but at least some trend there. Okay, so these are the results. These are the regressions of investigative reporting on our well, this is the diff in diff models for investigative reporting and accountability words. What we find is that Sun or like his ownership definitely increased or had a positive effect in the content of investigative reporting. And this effect is reliable and different from zero, but we don't observe the same for this count of accountability related words. What it's interesting here is like we try to like dig deeper and like really dissect what was going on. And here, for example, is instead of using just one indicator of like post-treatment and comparing just like the 6 months after and before, what we're doing is basically like an indicator by week. That's how we're defining the post-treatment period. And it's interesting because on average, you can see that this is all like, yes, getting to zero, but over time, this accountability count is increasing. So I don't want to say that there could be a reversal, right? Or there could be that on average, it doesn't matter if we're not seeing that change that strongly. But it's interesting to see that there are some dynamics here that suggest that things are changing in the newspaper. Okay, the second project is the second part of the project is trying to analyze um, like the prevalence of local news and whether Songshung is actually fulfilling this objective of like giving back to the community and focusing on the community's issues. And for that, we're going to classify the local news found in the front page and A1 sections of different newspapers as local or non-local. For that, we're going to use bidirectional encoder representations for transformer BERT for both the tokenizing process of like these articles, and also we're going to use a model and we're going to fine tune it. BERT is learning the co-occurrence of words from left and right. So when you're reading, it's like trying to learn the structure and how like these words are happening together in like these sentences, not only when you read from left to right, but if you do it from the other side. So it has proven to have like very good results. We chose this one for this task because it was like relatively easy, or so we thought, of course. But we actually had like really, really good results that I will show you in a sec. The BERT tokenizer was pre-trained on Wikipedia articles, so not exactly our corpus with news articles, but we thought that it was like a good match because the language and like the things that we expect to find in these two corpora were similar. The BERT model was retrained on 200 news pieces from the LA Times that a group of coders classified, one undergrad, two undergrad students, one grad student, and Allison and myself. We had some like validation processes that I'm very happy to talk about in the Q&A. And I'm putting here red star because ideally we should have retrained BERT on more newspapers, but at this point in time, we just had access to the LA Times. And we also had like some restrictions on for how long we could access the server with other data. So we had to actually be very quick. But I'm curious about your thoughts as text analysis experts here on like this particular step. The codebook that we used to classify these news articles as local or non-local was based on a codebook that we developed based on whether national figures were mentioned, whether the topic mentioned different cities, whether the main focus was actually the city, even if there were comparisons with other cities in the country. And that's how we trained also our coders. And the model reached an accuracy level of 0.92, which we thought it was very, very, very good. But we found like some interesting like mistakes that actually made sense and that we are planning to correct and to retrain the model for that. Okay, so this is just the pipeline of BERT. We had our training set that was just LA Times articles. We cleaned up the data, tokenized it, fine-tuned the model, and then we evaluated. And after that, we applied it to the tokens that we also extracted with BERT from our full corpus. Okay, so the results are that these are the results of regressing this classification of local versus non-local on our diff in diff approach, right? So these are the coefficients over time, increasing the post treatment period of this diff in diff effect. And what we see is like basically absolute null results. So at least in this categorization of local versus non-local, we see no effect in the content, even after many months of Sun Xiong being in charge of the LA Times. Okay, so the third and final analysis is related to inspecting the quality and impact of some of the news articles and the social media posts that we see from these news outlets. And for that, we're creating this typology of news topics, trying to identify hard versus soft local news, and as well as like some interaction with local versus non-local. For that, we are going to focus on soft versus hard news. That's our first dimension. Soft news include the sensationalist crime or like really impactful crimes committed in the city, sports, weather, and traffic. Things that are part of the community, but that are not like super relevant for like, for example, political discussions, policy discussions, etc. Whereas hard news actually focus on that discussion of politics, economic and issues and policy formulation. We are using climate change here because a lot of the pieces that we could find, although they were talking, let's say, about the California fires, they also had this climate change angle. So traditionally, the field wouldn't put some things related to weather here, but for this particular question, we think it's important. And also investigations of high-profile cases. For local versus non-local news, basically state plus city versus national and international. And for this analysis, we're only using newspapers from California. We run two separate structural topic models, one on the tweets and one on the news articles with 10 topics each. And our prevalence covariates are the treatment group, the treatment period, and the diff in diff, the interaction between the two to capture the diff in diff coefficient here. These are the topics for the tweets. and we're trying to classify them according to their focus and like type. It was interesting to get this customer feedback. So these were tweets like calling for like, "Hey, subscribe to the LA Times, and have you already subscribe to our paper and support your local journalist actor." So we found a lot of those customer feedback tweets. We also found some hard local news talking about policies, talking about political figures, political scandals, but from like an investigative reporting perspective. Sports, soft local news like sensationalist crimes and fires, soft local news related to weather, entertainment industry. Here, notice that we're coding it as both because for the LA Times, the entertainment industry might be actually not that soft, given that it's like the economic heart of the city. National and California interactions, high profile cases, other sensationalist news. And these were front pages that were just like getting tweeted to say, hey, go and read the newspaper from today. For the articles, we have local policy making, also arts and sports, natural disasters, content in Spanish, health and education policies. A lot of these were also related to like, hey, the Dodgers visited this hospital, or like, hey, we're talking about that we need more diversity in our rooms, but generally with like a local story or like a local profile. Um, Technology, housing, homelessness, national politics, and international news. And of course, I'm cherry picking, and I'm going to show you the plot that is the prettiest with respect to the parallel trends that we found in some of these topics. This is the proportion of topic customer feedback over time for the tweets. And I really like it because before Patrick Soon-Shiun took over it, basically it's like the trend is identical for those papers that were owned by a billionaire versus not. But after he takes over, you start seeing like really, really like strong differences or like disparities between the trends. This is in line with what we were reading or like observing in the newspapers. So I will show you the coefficients basically for like this DID coefficient, the difference in difference, to like that capturing the ATT of Soon-Shiun taking over the newspapers for the different topics that we estimated in both the tweets and the art and the news articles. Here we see that there's a positive effect of Soon-Shiun's tenure on the entertainment industry news or the prevalence of this news on hard local news and customer feedback. So again, based on like the qualitative exploration of our corpus, this definitely resonated, and like a decrease in the prevalence of sub news or like more national news. Um, However, we don't see the same thing in the actual articles published. So this was like the public facing Twitter, but in the articles, we see some positive effect in local issues like public safety, policing, and arts and sports, less so on, for example, national politics. But in general, we just see these increase in like soft local news as well. So not a focus on like the things that are like high quality that he claimed he wanted to focus on, but really more about local politics overall, with like this very interesting decrease in the prevalence of the topic housing and homelessness, which is one of the things that I think everyone wants to talk about and like actually see a discussion of it. So just to conclude, we actually find some support for this hypothesis one, that he had a positive effect on the content of the paper. We see increased levels of investigative reporting and a delayed increase in accountability words. We also see an increase in or increased focus on hard local news and a decreased focus on soft local and national news, but only in social media. So there are like some caveats here. We see increased focus on local topics, but mostly on soft news when it comes to the actual news articles of the paper. And we see an increased emphasis on customer feedback and enrollment efforts. So this is actually one of the most striking findings, that he's really trying to attract customers, to attract followers, and is probably failing at that because remember when I said that these billionaires might be volatile? He ended up selling the San Diego Union Tribune, and there are rumors that he wants to again resell the LA Times. So that cannot be captured by our data, but it's basically the conclusion after analyzing some of these things that it just might not be this profitable business that they are all envisioning it could be. So, but we still want to conclude that while some billionaires cause harm to their newspapers, some research finds that they cause harm to their newspapers, and that might contribute to increase inequality. We find here some partial evidence that other type of actors, more civic-minded billionaires, can actually improve some aspects of the paper and can at least help to promote local political learning and can at least save this like important piece of our civic culture and democratic culture. And hopefully we also provided a framework to evaluate other billionaires and other type of owners now that this is becoming a more recurrent phenomenon that we see in local media and journalism. And with that, thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to your comments and feedback.
Thank you, Michelle. I'll start off with a couple questions, and I'm sure Steve will hop in, and we already have at least one question in the Q&A. Okay, so my first question and comment is thinking about what is the optimal or best production function for investigative reporting? And let me just offer a distinction between two models. One model gives sort of an army of investigative reporters space to investigate deeply and produce a small number of very consequential pieces. So think, like the Theranos reporting didn't result in all that many stories, but was super consequential. Or you could imagine a different model that says, I want to give the impression that we're ramping up lots of investigations. So I'll send my reporters to a lot of, local meetings, and they'll ask hard questions to local politicians, but never dive deep. And the reason that distinction is consequential, I think, is if we think that the deep investigations matter more, it could be the case that the share of investigative words would go down, but the amount of socially desirable investigative reporting that is happening could be going up, if that makes sense. And so I was just sort of curious how you're thinking about that and or maybe how reporters think about that possible distinction.
These are super good points. Thank you. I think we were thinking about it like not as sophisticated as you're thinking because basically what we notice is not really a lot of nuance in like this. Well, it exists. What you're saying, it definitely exists. But here it's more about like, it's either some variation of these or nothing, right? Like, and I like that's especially what we see with like these hedge fund vultures coming. They just remove like the entire department of investigative reporting is like fired, and there's just like a lot of importing from newswire sources, so deleting also the local part and like focusing on like these cheap stories that are yeah that you can get in the community and like with almost zero effort. So we were less concerned about the nuance. I would say though that I like the investigative scores that Turkle et al. Developed because it's trying to capture different dimensions that you're mentioning, right? Like the influence for sure is one of them, but the fact that like a lot of people consider these a very influential, a very important piece or like high quality investigative reporting, and that's the reason why it won this award. Or like the embeddings, the actual content, or like all of these like different components of the index are trying to reflect that. But what I'm thinking about is that we could still like try to parse out all of these components and maybe like try to get these scores excluding different components at the time, or like almost trying to capture these two dimensions that you're talking about and see whether there's an effect. That would be super interesting. And I think you're right, and we should see it, but probably at a higher level among like these newspapers that are already established and doing something, and less so about some of these that are dying and like just need to like yeah like need to be safe basically, because this is when like the very drastic tactics just come. And
Yeah. Just a very brief follow-up on that before I let Steve ask a question. It seems, you talked about sort of a first stage effect there. The billionaires take over, and sometimes they completely get rid of the investigative unit, and sometimes they leave it or they may beef it up. Knowing the number of reporters who are on the investigative beat and how they're assigned within potential investigations would be a way to sort of get at exactly that idea. It's not text, but it, sort of begins to explain why you get your results.
yes, thank you, that's a great idea. I'm definitely putting it down and like talking to Allison about it. Yes, thank you.
Steve, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, thanks. Interesting talk. I've got some critical comments and questions. So first, let me just start with an observation, which you can disagree with if you don't, if you like. Profit-motivated owners have strong incentives to provide the kind of newspaper content that their readers want to read. And so is that bad? You implicitly take the stand that it is. But if so, why? You ought to articulate that. You don't really make a compelling argument, in my view. It's more like argument by innuendo. Profit-motivated owners are vultures. Benevolent billionaires are doing things in the public interest. So I find that part of your setup for the presentation quite unsatisfactory. Second comment is, it's odd to see the focus on local newspapers without an effort to situate them in the broader context of news sources, when the way people access and consume news is undergoing such profound changes. It's like the printing press comes out, I guess was well after the first printing press, but when newspapers started being circulated, and well, the local town crier is now out of business. And isn't that bad? Well, maybe newspapers may be the local newspapers may be the analog to the local town criers, maybe not. But at least it would be useful to try to situate your study in the context of some information about how it is that people now access and consume news, and particularly news about local issues in particular. That's just missing. And without that, it's very hard to know what to make. And there's a related thing, which is, well, maybe this is being made up by other sources of news. And Twitter, you look at Twitter, but Twitter's not really a very good medium for long form or even anything more than tweet form journalism. It's mainly used to go look at this, go look at that. So you have to look. You need to look at other sources. I don't know if Substack has a large local news content that actually do something that is more comparable to what we think of as the longer form articles supplied by journalism. So I just found that just missing. There's a lot of value judgments in the way you present things that I think the research would be stronger without. You talk about, did this one particular owner worsen or improve coverage? I just would restate that in neutral terms. It's not clear whether you seem to think that local news coverage is better than national news coverage for local newspapers. I don't know that you can argue it both ways. It's true that it might be better for the local news market quality. On the other hand, if the LA Times does a great investigative piece of national import, that has benefits throughout the country. And there was a time, it's not so true anymore, there was a time when the major regional newspapers in the United States did aspire to writing not only important national stories, but important international stories. And now, there's only a handful of newspapers which are national scope that really see that as a central part of their mission. So I just say, why don't you just couch it in terms of, do they do more local versus national? Do they do more soft versus hard? Do they do more long form investigative or not? Whether that's good or bad requires a lot of assumptions, either explicit or implicit, to judge. So that's just a comment about how you present things. And then I'll just make one more comment at this point. You got to raise the question of external validity. You got one, this is a case study. And if it's a template for how to do many case studies and we're going to accumulate them over time, that's one thing. But it's not hard to imagine that I might come to a very different assessment about how rich owners influence directly or indirectly newspaper performance and coverage. I could look at the Murdoch family. I could look at the Sulzberger family. You mentioned Bezos. So, they'll be very different case studies. So I guess I'd like you to speak to just, what, if any, are the broader messages of this study? So I gave you a lot. I'll let you respond.
Yes, no, but thank you. This is great. And a lot of these comments are really tapping into things that somehow, yeah, we've been challenging with, including the external validity question and trying not to be normative and be like, okay, what's good and what's bad. We're just like observing like these trends. But I would still say some things in my defense, in our defense there. So with external validity, yes. So we started this, as I said, like we saw it. It's like now hitting close to home, the fact that it's in LA and that I'm in LA and I get very excited about this. But we started it with like, let's have this test, let's like try to learn as much as we can from it, based on like this figure that is kind of like representing a good portion of them, like Henry and Glenn and others. And then we get more data about them, and we do this for Bezos, we do this for Glenn, and we do this for Henry, who acquired the Boston Globe. We started with this because we already had like some data about it, on it. It's been very, 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 very hard to get our hands on like this type of data over time, or like going back many years, um, especially with the objective of like mining it or like getting the full text. And it's been very, very expensive. So eventually the goal is to extend it like that and have like a bigger project, but we really needed to start relatively small because it was not small. Like we still spend a lot of money trying to get some of this data. So it was like our first test, and really with this idea of like, what can we learn about this? Like, how can we shape some expectations and actually like develop some theories based on like this particular case? I mean, also because it's an important case, right? It's like the LA Times, like one of like and it's California, one of the most important states. So that's a justification. But I'm with you there. This is providing some meat for what we eventually want to do and extend, and like trying to even start developing like these theoretical things. Now, for the assumption, as I said, we've been struggling to not be super normative, and we presented this a couple of times in the past, and people had like a similar concern of like, why are you taking this localization as a good thing? And this is also based on like what other people have found in their research. Like this is actually one of the few pieces that have a very strong theoretical basis, which is like, a local newspaper should be serving their local community. This doesn't mean that it should have 100% of local news. It's perfectly fine. I mean, even some of these news, especially in LA, it was hard to tease apart what part was national and what part was local when they were talking about interactions between the levels. So this is by no means saying it should be 100% local, but if it's your local newspaper, it should be talking about the things that you consider important and that are like affecting you directly, right? And if we believe the research that has found that more local knowledge leads to less polarization, or like to more participation, more engagement with the community, higher levels of knowledge, then we can like here put the thread on how we might actually want to see more of that, rather than just like newswire sources at the national level, like very cheap news that are not really talking about your community, but about isolated cases here and there that just look very sensationalist. So that's the motivation, or like at the core of why we are still trying to do some kind of typology in this case.
Well, yeah, but you can do the typology without the normative overlay of whether it's good or bad. I'm not persuaded by what you said. You might be right, but what you said so far doesn't persuade me that on the margin, more local is better than less local. Again, it
No, yeah,
depends on the context within which people are acquiring their news and so on, and that's a very complex issue.
yes, agree. And even the quality, right? Like it could be like, it doesn't matter if they're
Sure.
gonna only talk about the pumpkin patch,
The wire
the fall
services would
festival.
object to your characterization of what they're supplying, which
No,
I'm not here
but
to defend the wire services, but
and I work with a lot of their data, so I don't want to antagonize them. But it's true that it's generally, I generally work with images from wire sources, and you can tell that it's like very focused on particular national cases or things that are like very disconnected from the community. Even when you talk about protests, for example, like you don't get a picture from your protest, like your local protest, but you get a picture from a protest in Washington or a protest in DC, which is actually a little bit harder to connect to, or it's like providing less information about like this local activity in your community. But no, I fully agree with that. I don't want to make it cartoonish and say it's just about that. That's why we have like these like different distinctions of soft versus hard, local versus non-local. But with yes, very aware that it might depend, and probably we need to do a better job at like tapping some of these things. Like maybe local hard is better, and again, not like all of that, but a higher proportion, so the community is getting informed. But we will tone it down and like think. I like the idea of like a little bit more open. And then I would just like quickly say something about the newspapers. Yes, part of the motivation is to use Twitter, and I deleted that slide, but I even had like a screenshot of a tweet saying, I don't subscribe to the New York Times. This is how I consume news. Like people saying those things where their newspaper is actually Twitter. Um, uh, so it was like a way of like trying to get at that, knowing that not a lot of people are going back and like reading the printed versions. But yes, I mean we're just assuming that they are here. Some people are consuming them for better or worse. There's some research that like suggests that it's important. So I like the idea of Substack. I will need to think more about, well, how first of all can justify how people are consuming this news and whether this is still relevant, and second, if I can think of other sources that could be interesting to include in the analysis. So thank you so much.
Okay, we got a couple questions in the Q&A. First, could we give Erin Carter the microphone? Let her ask her question.
Hello. Hi guys. Sorry, I'm a bit sick today, so I apologize for my voice. So really interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I have two questions. Please choose whichever you feel interested in. So the first one is I'm curious about whether there's a calendar to this sort of thing. So in our propaganda book, we found that autocrats, when they bought or acquired newspapers in some way, they in general maintain pretty objective coverage actually to get people to buy in and view the newspaper as credible. And then they spent it right before political crises and elections, most importantly. And I'm curious if you see some sort of similar business calendar for these billionaires, right? So are they just letting the LA Times do its own thing until right before a big deal, the billionaire is implicated in some way, or some sort of other political business cycle moment that you think is important, or even elections themselves, right? So maybe these billionaires are supporting political candidates because they want a certain set of policies out of the LA government. So do you see that sort of differential coverage, according to business or political calendars? I think that'd be really. I'm just curious if you looked into that. The second thing I was wondering about, so like less charitably, one might think that billionaires are funding investigative journalism to investigate their rivals. So I'm really curious if you would did you look into any sort of real world heterogeneous effects, right? Do you see, their business rivals engaging in less fraud or different behavior or investment decisions after the acquisition? Right. Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you so much. I love this question. I would say we haven't done any of those, but it's like really like I will like start like working on that, like, and then identifying even like some like periods. I mean, we are kind of like limited here in terms of given that the treatment period is just like fixed. We don't have that much. I mean, we can go before, but I haven't gone like that far after. But that's something that we can explore. So I will definitely go there. I mean, one thing that I should say, and it's kind of related to both questions that I find them super fascinating. We haven't done that deep exploration to see like, okay, what are they publishing about their rivals and like identifying even this in the first place. But for example, we tried to look for like the number of times that Sun Xiong was like mentioning his own businesses, or like he was mentioning the sector in which like his businesses are, to see if he was using this as a platform for like self promotion. And there, surprisingly, there was nothing. Like it was like really hard to even identify that. Like the few things that we see is with, for example, the topic technology that we see there were some changes, but overall in that one we didn't see anything. But I will dig deeper into what you said and like actually try to code it because it's a super good idea, and I think like a very interesting angles that like tell us about how rich these interactions and like this, yes, how this can be used as a platform, right? So this is super interesting. Thank you.
Okay, and Elizabeth, can we give Elizabeth Elder the microphone to ask her question?
Hi, thank you so much. So I was thinking about the kind of pattern of results that you found, and thinking that it would be really hard to differentiate them between, someone who was kind of trying to improve the quality of coverage in the paper in some way versus someone who was just taking a pretty long view of the potential resale options. Maybe he wants to hold on to the paper for 10 years. And in that case, you don't want to gut the staff and, move everything on, do what the Cleveland Plain Dealer did, but you want to maintain the brand, you want to win some awards, you want to increase circulation. Like these seem like the kind of things that you would want to do if you had kind of a, just a not particularly short-term view of making a profit. And not necessarily being charitable, just thinking longer term. So I was just curious if you had done any thinking about maybe ways that these owners might be thinking about economic value that they get from this differently, and if there truly would be if there's any way to identify whether there is like what would it look like to have a purely philanthropic motive here? Like what would we expect to see if Jeff Bezos really did just want to spend money on owning the Washington Post and never intended to make it back? What kind of patterns would we expect to see in order to identify someone who is being philanthropic versus people with different pictures in their minds of how to get the most value out of these investments?
Yeah, this is a super interesting question. So, and I think it's going to be related to something that Steve mentioned and that I didn't. Is like we're also cynical. We're not saying that like just like a philanthropic objective or like these philanthropic statements like really evidence their true objectives and are just going to do it for like the love to this art or like for love to their communities. I definitely think that there's something about like profit and about business. These are businessmen, right? Like this is all about how they've been successful at like selling things to people. So I there's definitely this component that I'm not entirely sure how to disentangle because in a way, like one of the ideas that we had is to include also like circulation rates or like money invested in some of these things over time. It's kind of like difficult again because of the data points, and it would also like be difficult to basically estimate the utility curve. So you have like some investment in terms of resources, let's say, and there are also like some even ideological resources that you might invest or emotional resources or all the resources that you have and the costs versus what you're getting out from this. So we are like struggling to find that, and I think that that's why it makes like this particular question really hard. What I can say though is that what we were trying to find and that we got like glimpses of it is, for example, like this idea of like, well, if you're really trying to increase the number of subscribers, it's like giving you some indication that like they are like, yes, of course, if they want to survive, they need to do this. In this particular case, for example, we know that he already invested a lot of money on the LA Times. So he really wanted this to work out, and then the rest, then the rest we are like just uh we're basing this evaluation based on what he said, that he was doing this because it was like more like of an internal thing than a business. But we should probably add the other component. I can't promise that we will be able to disentangle like these two dimensions there, but at least it would be very good to have that part too.
Okay, we have about a minute left, so I'm going to make one more suggestion just to give a +1 on something Steve said. I also had written down a question, why is profit motive bad? Because you imagine lots of good things can come from profit motives as well. But another way, if there's one way to do this, which is to pivot away from some of the claims that are made in the paper, just to focus on exactly what you can with the newspaper. Another thing that you could try to show, though, is if you established outcomes that you cared about and that you think newspapers in some way cause those outcomes or influence those outcomes. So, for example, behavior of elected officials, something like discovery of fraud in an area, information that citizens have when they vote. It's obviously a hard thing to measure, but if you can show, however you might do it, that different ownership structures affect these outcomes, that you can make a strong case. I think we can all agree, more fraud from politicians, that we're worse off. Less fraud, we're better off. Citizens knowing more about what they're going to vote on when they go to the ballot box. That might be a thing that we can all agree that is probably better. If you can point to those, then I think you're in a position where you can make these sorts of stronger arguments. And so absent those, it's challenging.
Okay. Perfect. No, makes sense.
Yep.
No, and just to be clear, I share the skepticism, and I don't think that making profit is bad per se. It's just that when they interview them, like there are some honest ones like Zell being like, I'm just here for the money. And there
Yeah.
are others that I'm like, I'm here because I love LA. And it's like
Yeah.
but I know that they're probably not like doing it just for that. But
Mm.
it's like basically what the public discourse is and like what they are self-proclaiming to be interested in. But I love this idea. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, well, just to be clear, I'm here because this was a great paper, not because I was being paid to be here. And Michelle, that was outstanding. Thank you so much. So folks can stick around. We can ask Michelle some more nitty-gritty questions, and we can now thank her for this great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for the invitation and for this great feedback. Stay tuned for a second version of this paper. Thank you.